Hello, class. So this is the first of two recorded lectures we're going to do in lieu of me being in New Orleans this week. The first one I want to cover is Nature's Metropolis, the Cronon chapter called Dreaming the Metropolis. This is chapter 1. So I want to go over the main points and make sure everybody's clear on the main points. Also things that are going to be relevant for the exam, which isn't too far away. Anyway, let's go over the main points of this reading. So chapter 1, Cronon starts off, he's talking about the land. The land is the most important concept in this whole chapter. It's a longer chapter, but the essence of the chapter is land. Okay, this is not urban land or rural land, it's land. The whole chapter is really about where Chicago takes place, or Chicago grows up, I should say. Chicago, the wild garlic place, as he refers to it. So the land emerged to be an urban place because of certain patterns that the land took, certain shapes that the land took. There's certain reasons, a certain natural legacy to why Chicago is where it is, right? For example, the river. Where ships found shelter when the lake, he said something about there being angry moods of the lake. So the ships in Lake Michigan would find shelter from these moods, and the river inlet is where they did that. The river also granted access to the interior settlements, both to the east and to the west. There was a ridge that divided the two great watersheds to the east and to the west. The ridge also marked a stopping point for the advance of the glaciers during the last ice age. This affected the soil in an interesting way, making the soil fertile to the south, but then less fertile to the north. Also creating a particular type of tree that becomes very important to Chicago's development in the lumber industry. We'll read about this a little later this term. So all these things, the type of the river, the type of soil, a specific type of tree, the ridge, these are all part of Chicago's natural legacy. This is the importance of natural history and where Chicago came to be a major city. Okay, so we're already starting to see the importance of nature as a player in the city itself, in that it created the groundwork for where Chicago was sited. Okay. So it was once people started to appraise these natural legacies that it really become that they started to actually mean something, right? This is what Cronon says is the dream of Chicago. So indigenous people, native people have been using this area obviously for a very long time. The settler dream, as settlers started to move westward, the European settlers, was actually something of a conquest of the native, the indigenous peoples' cultural understanding of land. Okay, we see this pretty quickly in the chapter. So the first European settlers came sometime around 1770. The American army followed in around 1803. And at first, actually, Europeans and indigenous people got along relatively well. There was some, Cronon refers to this as a hybrid cultural universe. But settlers brought with them a different way of seeing land. They brought with them a different notion of understanding land. That is, understanding land as property, as bounded. Right? There's chunks of land that were usable based on what you owned. Okay. So land as real estate. The two conceptions of land came into conflict, especially in 1832, when Chief Black Hawk crossed in from Iowa and said something really important. He said land cannot be sold, because in their minds, land was life. Land and life could not be separated. And therefore, the rights to the land could not be alienated, not even by the native people. So their way of living had been sort of broad and unbounded, whereas the conception of land as property has very clear boundaries and definitions. There was a military conflict. The U.S. military eventually massacred the indigenous people, and afterwards, a sizable military force ended up settling in Chicago because of they were attracted to Chicago's natural attributes. This resettling changed the economic and cultural landscape of the region as the population quickly expanded. So eventually, the U.S. government consolidated its lands in the areas through treaties. And of course, these treaties were sort of outside of the comprehension of the indigenous people that had been living there. This was not part of their lexicon. And it was really the way land was conceived, the way the land was understood by settlers, and then the way that land was understood by native people were so different that these treaties really were sort of meaningless to the people that lived there before. After this hybrid cultural universe was shattered by this new sort of imagination of land, Chicago started to grow rapidly, sort of the way that we saw cities growing in Asia and Africa, the second day of class. Chicago grew from a few hundred in 1832 to around 400,000 in 1840. And land speculation was rampant around the time, especially during the 1830s. There was examples of land appreciating from $100 range to the $1,000 range in a single day. And we thought Portland was bad. So real estate, though, was the only game in town. There was really no economic basis for the speculation. It was more of a sugar high. And then, as such, the real estate market collapsed in 1837. The importance of this period of speculation was the inscription of this way of seeing the land as an economic thing, as an asset which can generate wealth. This was very much new in the region. From here, Cronon starts to talk about Frederick Jackson Turner's frontier thesis. Okay, the frontier thesis was really, or the frontier for Turner was this sort of moving boundary as Europeans moved westward. It was sort of a slow process that as Europeans moved westward, they were sort of spreading civility to the savagery of the native people that lived there. The idea was that, as the Europeans moved westward, they would bestow upon these savage people the civilized way of doing things, which included, of course, seeing land as real estate, right? What Cronon is saying is that actually this frontier thesis is all wrong. I mean, maybe we could pick that up right away, right? This seems maybe in today's day and age to be an obvious example of sort of political violence, right? This is exactly what Cronon is saying. He's like, this is not due to natural progress at all. It was actually a series of political choices that were supported by force and violence, very clearly. So it wasn't necessarily civil. There was nothing civilized about it. It was completely political and oppressive and dominating. Speculation at the time was based on the notion of an urban future. And this is something Cronon harps on. He comes back to this throughout the chapter. Turner's frontier thesis is basically saying that eventually things go from sort of a agricultural hunter-gatherer type of society and progresses through a series of stages, and the city is sort of this like ultimate, sort of final stage where everything is wonderful and so on. But Cronon is saying something very different. He's saying actually this begins with the city. This whole idea begins with the city. The city is sort of imagined at the outset. And this is the idea. Speculation is based on the idea that there will be a great city. So the city is already there mentally, even if it's not there physically. The only trick is building it and figuring out a way to build it, right? How do we build the city? How do we convert nature into cities, right? So this language of destiny starts to really kind of come up all over the place. And Cronon starts talking about how speculation is really sort of based on these fictitious drawings on maps. Not that they're fictitious because they're not there, but because it's a different way of seeing land, right? This is not the way that the people that had been living there for thousands of years had envisioned land at all. the language of natural advantages starts to creep in here. And Chicago certainly has some natural advantages, right? It has the best harbor in the southern part of Lake Michigan. It's located, like we said, on this ridge between these two watersheds. However, the river didn't connect all the way through, and so they needed to dig a canal. And anybody who's ever been to Chicago is familiar with this canal with all these bridges, right? So the speculative boom that Chicago saw during this time had much to do with the mapping of this canal, these sort of newly produced maps, because the land on either side of the river was going to become valuable, right? So then you started to see some people who were really kind of pushing this boom according to the way the city was going to be built, a new type of imagination, which was fueling the search for the new great American city of the West. There was already cities in the East like Boston and Philadelphia and New York City and so forth that were great cities at the time, but the West was still sort of, non-urban, maybe we can say. So the search was sort of on, and there became a new type of booster, is the term that Cronon uses, that was trying to sell the idea of the city to people who were moving westward at the time, to European settlers who were moving westward at the time. So the boosters develop this sort of model, right? This model is based on, it's sort of like an early model on urban and regional growth, which is rooted in the relationship between cities and their hinterlands, their surrounding countrysides. And this becomes something of a self-fulfilling prophecy, right? This is sort of the way the cities start to develop. And boosters really are developing this model, in a sense, because they need to sell this theory of development to investors and merchants who are moving east, who have the money to speculate on land and set up shop on the land. Cronon gives us this interesting quote about nature becoming the world's most reliable real estate broker. So nature as a real estate player assures investors of their decisions, and the whole thing becomes sort of a natural process, sort of like just seen as a progressive way to live, and the whole process is underwritten by nature, because nature is sort of the thing that gives us these gifts, right? Gives settlers these gifts. So these natural advantages that boosters start talking about fall into really three categories: resources that are available for trade, transportation routes to distribute these resources, and then strangely global climatic forces, which we'll talk about in a second. So the first two obviously are connected. The resources from a region are just what it pulls in from the hinterlands. So a city's, this is the part of the model, the city's sort of core is a set of markets, right? And the hinterlands is where the resources come from. The resources are shipped into the markets, processed in like the manufacturing facilities, and then distributed vis-a-vis these transportation routes. So you see the first two. The third one, the climactic aspect, is a little stranger, and it's sort of built on these racist assumptions of the biological ability of non-white people to survive outside of tropical zones. And then migration to cities becomes described sort of in these other natural metaphors like gravity, that, the cities are the stars around which these smaller towns are going to orbit, and transportation routes all will develop accordingly. So the trick was to find the star. What city is going to be the star? There was a lot of these sort of smaller cities around at the time. Maybe we could even call them villages. They're very small. And the boosters were sort of betting on certain cities to become the star city, right? That all the other smaller towns would end up orbiting. One guy in particular, Scott, had something of a statistical formula that showed all these natural advantages coming together best in Chicago. The idea of a star city was really based on the fact that there needed to be a major city somewhere around where Chicago was in order to become like in order to control commerce and trade in the interior West. New York had been a dominant city and was a dominant city at the time, but there is this assumption that New York, like Rome, would rise and fall, and something would have to take its place. There was also a strong belief in, American democracy at the time and the power of commerce. Early industrial capitalism was really ramping up, in the United States, and then there was a lot of the sort of like kind of a philosophy behind it that was becoming further ingrained in people's consciousness. Things like market relations are a better way to sort of control trade and so forth than taxes were. And this was a more the language of freedom sort of shows up here, where if we rely on market exchange and market relations, that's a freer way of doing things than collecting tribute, which was the case in Europe. The idea of expansion was wrapped up in this too. The idea that commerce and exchange also was a very good way to expand. The idea, though, was that in doing this through market relations and market exchange and so forth, you didn't need to rely on violence or domination. Now, it's pretty clear from what we were talking about before that that wasn't the case at all. And actually, the army violently cleared out people that stood in the way of expanding in this way. So the narrative that commercial expansion provided a pacific and mutually beneficial set of relationships based on free trade, liberal democracy, et cetera, weren't exactly true. In fact, urban markets were actually dependent on another form of tribute, and that was the tribute offered by the rural areas surrounding the city. The idea was that these rural areas should also benefit from the cities, or Chicago in our case, Chicago's prosperity. And the boosters of Chicago really forwarded these rational arguments for why settlers should expect the West to develop as a model of a commercial system steered by a network of cities, Chicago being the star city, as we were talking about. And the hierarchy, which would be determined by the natural advantage of each city. So it comes back to the natural advantage of each city. So here, Cronon goes back to Turner's frontier thesis. Okay, so what did Turner see? Turner saw this slow progression from hunter-gatherer society to through agricultural growth and so forth, eventually ending up in the city. But for boosters, cities appeared much quicker and were inseparable from their hinterlands. Together, they actually formed the system itself, both the hinterland and the city. They were there, and they were co-present. They were co-present in the model, right? So it was important. It was important for the boosters that landscapes had to have a market. There had to be a market for landscapes. All the things that were could be grown in the hinterlands and etc. had to find a market in the city. Next, Cronon turns to this idea of central place theory, which this is sort of an early land use model. And it attempts to explain spatial relationships along with economic linkages between the city and the countryside. This is in a lot of ways, this is what the boosters were saying. There has to be sort of a relationship between the hinterlands of the city and the center of the city. Okay? And Cronon is saying there's actually a lot more similarities. It's a better model. The central place theory model of von Thunen, which we'll see in Girardet as well, is actually a better way to explain. It actually resolves some of the problems with Turner's model, the frontier. So there's two key variables in von Thunen's central place theory. First, how much people in the city would pay for goods grown in the country, okay? And then second, how much it costs to transport those goods to the market. So this is sort of the basis. These are the assumptions that von Thunen makes in creating his model. So closest to the city would be the bulky, heavy, and perishable things, the things that are expensive to transport. And next would be forests for lumber and fuel. And then after that, you have grains and livestock, things that take a little bit more space, right? And then according to von Thunen's assumptions, rents would fall with distance. So market exchange economies mean that trade between city and country are a great determinant of cultural and environmental change and development. This is according to von Thunen. Cronon says that reading Turner backwards is to recognize that the frontier is not an isolated rural society, but rather the edge of an expanding empire. Okay? So he's adding something to both models. He says Turner expects the frontier to sort of develop over time. There's the idea of progress. Turner's stages are co-present in von Thunen's model. So the central place theory model forwarded by von Thunen, you'll see if you go into the GRD book, you can see these sort of concentric circles building outward. Okay, Turner's stages, rather than be sort of a linear thing through time, are co-present in von Thunen's model. So the frontier and the metropolis are two sides of the same coin. So Cronon gives us two observations about von Thunen. He says city and country are inseparable, and the relationship is mediated by the market. We talked about this the other day. The economy is going to be a central mediator. Okay. Second, von Thunen's model has no historical contingency. So places are different because their histories are different, right? So Chicago developed at a particular point in time, and it developed in a particular way because it developed at that point in history. The one thing that Cronon adds that neither model really sort of deal with is capital. The idea of capital is an important key because it explains the speed at which Chicago grew. The center of the modern empire was capitalism's marketplaces. These marketplaces played a key role in transforming nature into economic assets that could accumulate wealth. Without that wealth, cities would never have grown. So Turner's frontier for Cronon is the leading edge of an expanding market that converts nature into capital. Capital has to come from somewhere. Cronon is saying it comes from nature. The critical thing that happens in this chapter is the extension of the market to the land. Okay? The reconceptualization of land as property that's bounded, that can develop wealth, that can accrue capital. This is something that was entirely outside the imagination of the indigenous people that lived in the area. It's not that they didn't want to sell land, it's that they didn't have an understanding of what it meant to sell land. So the U.S. at this point was essentially a commercial enterprise that sought to, this is Cronon, that sought to transform natural assets into economic capital. So these natural advantages that we've been talking about, the idea of expansion at the time was how do we convert this into money, right? Into capital, I should say. Cities are obviously play an enormous role in this process. And this was something of a new way for humans to relate to the land, to really sort of be metabolizing land, right? To be pulling trees down and converting them into timber, to be taking land and converting it into real estate, and so on. So even the non-economic dreams, things like freedom, community, and so on, according to Cronon, were still predicated on commercial growth, right? Cronon gets pretty severe towards the end of this chapter. He says the land was not free, but taken, right? Once land enters the market, he says it will never be free again. The conception of land is forever changed, right? And that's sort of where he leaves us in chapter 1. I think it's most important to remember the way land is conceived differently as the settlers move west. The idea that land becomes something other than land. It becomes sort of a way to accrue capital, to accrue wealth, okay? As such, we can do things with the land. We can do different things with the land. We can own it. We can build things on it. We can turn it into factories. We can put things from the land into those factories. We could change the shape of those things into commodities that we sell, that we ship far away. And this is sort of a vital thing for cities. Cities can't be cities without these sorts of market relations. So again, we're sort of seeing the role of the economy, or maybe what we can call an economic imagination, in the way they develop cities. Okay? Thanks for watching, guys.